So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm delighted to be here, not only because I believe very much in engaging history and in active history, but Huron is where I did my undergraduate degree. And it's a very odd feeling being in this room. The last time I can remember being in this room, this floor was very sticky and there was a lot of beer. My name's Wendy Rowney, and I'm Assistant General Manager at Black Creek Pioneer Village, and I've spent most of the last 2 decades trying to figuring out, I hope, working on figuring out, how it is that we make history engaging for a general audience. How do we engage people in learning? So I'm going to talk less about how do we engage people in the creation of history, and more about how do we make the learning of history engaging. When, as the panelists, we began speaking about this, the question that was posed to us initially was, why should history be engaging? And I thought, what I work on every day, what I try to figure out is how can history be engaging? As a public historian and a museum educator, as I said, I've spent much of the past 20 years figuring out what draws people to learn about history. How do I interest people, ranging from preschoolers to older adults, in history? How do I create programs that engage their minds and hold their interest and motivate them to return? And that motivation to return is very important to me as a public historian, because as a museum, our numbers count. Every year, we have to report how many families, how many school children, how many volunteers, how many members come through our doors. And it matters that 50,000 school children and 70,000 families learned history at our museum last year. It matters that people gave us 6,500 hours of volunteer time, and then another 15,000 or so chose to use our site as a wedding and business destination. So these are factors, among others, that are necessary for us when we're applying for our major museum operating grants. We have to demonstrate that the public finds us engaging, or we lose the funding that we require. So for the past 20 years, I've been working at Black Creek, as I said, and those of you who grew up in Toronto probably went there. Almost everybody goes there when they're in grade 3. When I tell people where I work, after they say things like, "That must be so relaxing," a lot of them, like a disproportionate number of people will say, "I went there when I was in grade school." Yeah, and I see people nodding. Here we go. "I went there when I was in grade school, and I wore a costume, and I made a spoon." And I think to myself, you know what? Whatever it was that they learned, and whatever they've gone on to and to do in their lives, that's demonstrating that history was engaging for them at that moment, that it has stayed with them so strongly that this is the thing that they have to tell me about the place where I work. So before there was Black Creek, there was DL Pioneer Park, and it opened in 1956 in an 1809 barn located pretty much across the street from where Black Creek is right now. And it was an exhibit-based history museum, and hundreds of thousands of people went through its doors in its about first 4 years of operation. That's an astonishing number of people between 1956 and 1960. And what was engaging them were exhibits about spinning and maple syrup making and side saddles and beehives. It was so successful that it led to the purchase of a neighboring farm and the decision to turn this into a living history museum. The Toronto Region Conservation Authority that owned the village, they moved a number of buildings, historic buildings, from the neighboring areas there and opened the doors as a museum in 1960. They continued to move buildings there for the next about 20 years or so, and it's meant to show what a crossroads community looked like in the middle of the 19th century. As I mentioned, Black Creek is what is called a living history museum, and as many of you probably know, essentially what a living history museum needs to have in order to operate is an educational mandate, a collection of some kind, and to have your artifacts arranged in period room settings. Sometimes you have people who dress up, who are called interpreters or costumed educators, but you don't have to. Sometimes you can do tours, but you don't have to. Sometimes you do demonstrations, but you don't have to. So it can really encompass a wide variety of different types of museums: historic houses, historic forts, pioneer villages, that kind of thing. And when this type of museum began appearing in the mid-20th century, they were phenomenally popular. What mid-century visitors found engaging, what drew them by the hundreds of thousands, was demonstrations of period crafts and trades. What I often refer to as how-to history: how to make a nail, how to make a quilt, how to bake a cookie. And as far as I can tell, the costumed educators focused almost exclusively on this. They were talking about how to do 19th century crafts and trades, and they were showing people. And what they were doing at the time was incredibly groundbreaking. We don't think that today, because we've all grown up in a world where living history museums are all over the place. But they hadn't been. They were never around before that. And most people had never seen someone cook in a brick bake oven, or demonstrate how to make a broom, or pierce a tin lantern. And demonstrating these trades and crafts in period rooms, in period costumes, was a revolutionary way of teaching, and people found it very engaging for several decades. Around the middle of the 1990s, incidentally, precisely when I started my career in living history, there started to be a decline across the country, across the continent really, in the number of people that were going to living history museums. And for about a decade before this, museologists had been talking a lot about there were problems with living history, and we needed to add in they'd say things like the grime and the slime. We needed to talk about class, we needed to talk about race, we needed to talk about gender. We needed a real re-examination of the buildings that people were putting into living history museums and what kind of stories they were being used to tell. And most public historians agreed that we needed to move away from how-to history. And what they came up with was a way to introduce social history and historical context. And they did this a lot, and I've done it myself a lot, through sort of a hybrid of drama and programming. So you have recreations of funerals, recreations of weddings, this kind of thing. But generally speaking, underlying this system, there's still one of demonstration and watching. These types of programs were engaging, I believe, because they're very immersive and that visitors really feel or felt like they were traveling back in time when they were attending this wedding or funeral or baseball game or dance or whatever it happened to be. They're action-based, but the activity was usually, it was a means to an end. So you didn't just talk about, You didn't just talk about cricket or just play cricket, or baseball or have a dance or whatever it was you were talking about. You used these as a portal or a doorway to talk about broader historical topics. So for example, if you're demonstrating butter churning, I can demonstrate butter churning for you. I could make butter in a churn. But I'm not quite sure, I don't know exactly what you're going to take away from that in terms of broader historical ideas. So usually you would use that as a means to start talking about gender, rural versus urban history at the time period, foods, what people were eating, a whole host of topics. It's very common in some circles for people to look at living history and think that what it is a dumbing down of history. And obviously, you cannot make arguments that are as complex as you can if you're writing a book or an article or something like that. But that's not what people are looking for. It takes several hours, usually, or days to read a book, and no one, not even the most enthusiastic, wants to listen to an interpreter or read an exhibit panel for hours at a time. So you have to be able to distill what it is that you're talking about. You have to be able to take what are the main ideas and make them interesting and engaging for your audience. And we also need to keep in mind that the vast majority of the audience right now, for a whole host of reasons, are 8 years old. And no one who wants to live to tell the tale is going to try to lead a university tutorial with a grade 3 class. So history has to be presented at developmentally correct or appropriate levels. And usually, that when you're gearing something towards an 8-year-old, you're going to be talking about ideas that make sense to them at that point. And when they come back in grade 7 and grade 8, because that's the only time you have to do Canadian history, you approach it a slightly different way. You talk a lot about war, quite frankly, with them, and injustice. And then when they come back and they work for us when they're in university, then you can present it in an entirely different way yet again. In 2014, a colleague and I received funding to study what visitors found engaging in museums, and specifically what was drawing them in and what was bringing them back. We visited 13 top-tier North American museums with a reputation for high levels of visitor engagement. And we watched visitors while we were there. And then we talked to the public historians who were putting together the exhibits, the activities, and the programs to figure out if what they had intended was actually what people were doing, and if they thought the way they thought it would be engaging, if in fact it was. And we came away with 6 key learnings about what is engaging in museums for visitors. And I believe that when these elements are in place, people are engaged and they're motivated to learn. So I'm going to run through them fairly quickly. So the first one is people make all the difference. And when I talk about people here, I'm talking about costumed educators. Not every museum has them, of course, but if you have a living history museum, if you're trying to teach history in a living history museum setting, having costume educators makes all the difference. Time and time again, what we saw was when you had someone who was in costume, the visitors flock to that person. And I believe it's because that person becomes a substitute time traveler, if you will. So they can talk to that person. It's a safe person. They look just like you and me. They have funny clothes on, but they look just like you and me, and I can talk to them and find out what it is I need to know about the past. It becomes far more accessible for them. The second one is that people enjoy learning about real people from the past. And this was new for me, actually, because for most of my career, I had talked about, or I had trained people to talk about, to say very generally, well, people in the 19th century, generally speaking, believe this, or these people believe that, or this is what happened. But what I've discovered is that I was wrong, and visitors are more engaged when they're learning about actual, real people. Because I think what they're doing then is they're making connections between their own lives and the stories that they're hearing being told. And you can do this. You can introduce real people through a number of different ways in living history museums. You can look at primary documents and bring them out and have people look at census records or maps or whatever it is. There's a fabulous museum many of you may know called the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City. And this is one of the museums we went to. And honestly, it looked like what is that? Is it a scrum? Is that what they call it? When everybody jumps. The interpreter brought out the map, and everybody was an adult in this room, and they basically jumped on the table to look at this thing. They were so engaged with the idea of actually seeing the census record of the people whose apartment they were in, that they were literally elbowing other people out of the way. You can also introduce real people through drama. We've recently introduced a history actor program at Black Creek, and Mill City Museum, if you ever happen to find yourself in Minneapolis with a free afternoon, I highly recommend going to Mill City Museum. It's a fabulous, fabulous place. And they have recreated actual historical people from the past, and they use their stories, they dramatize their stories, and this is how they engage people. The next is that people learn by doing, and this is a really, really key thing, key learning. I can talk to you about how a printing press works. I can show you how a printing press works, or you can print on the press. And I can guarantee you that the thing that you're going to go home at the end of the night and talk about at dinner is the printing on the press. What we have to keep in mind is what I mentioned earlier, that this needs to stay as a means to an end. The printing on the press is not the key idea, otherwise you would just go to somewhere where you print on presses. I don't know where that would be. Or it was just somewhere, where whatever it is you're going to do. But once you've got them hooked, once you've got them doing something, then you can talk to them about the broader historical ideas that you want to bring in. Technology can enhance learning when it encourages interaction between people and their environments. There's a fabulous app at the Met in New York called Murder at the Met. And of course there they're not teaching history so much as they're teaching art history. And this app was designed for middle school, high school students. And it's like a clue game. So there's a woman in a painting and she's been murdered, and you have to look for the weapon and you have to look for the murderer and the location by going around and looking at different pieces of art in the American wing of the Met. And instead of just racing through, what the kids are doing is they're having to go up and actually examine these paintings. And this is an app, the game, can only be done in this specific location. So it's not something you can do at home. You couldn't do it at Black Creek. We don't have these paintings. So when technology increases the connection between the people, your visitor, and your location, and encourages them to look further, to think deeper, it's very effective in terms of engaging people with the learning of history. Personal stories create connections. One of the criticisms that's long been lobbied at living history museums is that they're a failure to bring in different types of stories. And there's a whole host of historical reasons for why that's the case. And in part, this is because of the period that they're meant to portray, and you have a number of buildings, and you have to demonstrate, and you have to use these buildings, and that can be difficult to talk about people of different ethnocultural backgrounds, different classes, this kind of thing, when what you're presented with, your buildings, all tell one very similar story. So what I think we need to do as public historians is look at different ways to layer history on top of the stories that we're already telling. So you can do that, for example, through effective apps. You could do that through exhibits. And that brings me to my last point, is that different kinds of learning tools work well together even in the same space. We need to get away from the idea that at a living history museum, you have a bunch of period rooms and people demonstrate things in them. And if you're at a traditional museum, you have exhibit panels and you walk around and you look at them. And if you're at an archives, you have primary documents, paper documents, and you study them. And we need to say, you know what, all of these things go together. We don't have to say this is one, this is the other, this is the third one. What we're saying is all of these things work well together, and when you include them all together, people are engaged, and they're smart. They understand that if you have an exhibit panel in your historic house that wasn't there when the people lived there in the 1860s. They get that. So what I believe is that people are engaged when the process of learning, when the learning process seems relevant to them. So when how they are learning, how we teach them is engaging for them, then they will embrace what it is that they're learning, and they will find that it is engaging. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rowney.